The mountains were quiet that morning, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Fog rolled low through the hollows, wrapping every pine and maple in a silvery hush. Ranger Ellie Madsen sipped her coffee slowly, her boots propped on the railing of her cabin's porch. This was her favorite part of the day, the hush before the world woke up. Out here in the Blue Ridge backcountry, peace wasn't a luxury. It was a rhythm, a truth. But even in that quiet, something felt off. She paused, tilted her head slightly. There it was again, soft at first, then clearer. A cry, thin, high-pitched. Not the chirp of a fledgling or the yip of a pup. It was deeper, more desperate. A single sharp note that pierced the veil of fog like a needle. Ellie set her coffee down without a word, instinct already moving her body before thought could. She'd been a ranger for nearly 12 years, and she'd learned to listen to those sounds, the ones that didn't belong. She grabbed her binoculars, slung her field pack over her shoulder, and followed the call into the woods. The ground was damp beneath her boots, every step pressing into moss and half-decayed leaves. Sunlight tried to break through the trees, but failed. The forest was holding on to its shadows. The cry sounded again, closer now, shorter, fainter. Ellie slowed near the base of a fallen oak, its thick trunk twisted like an old giant brought to its knees. There, tangled in its gnarled roots and curled into a shallow dip in the earth, was a bobcat kitten. Alone. No more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Its fur was patchy from mud, ears still too big for its head, eyes wide and rimmed with exhaustion. It didn't run when it saw her. It didn't even flinch. Just looked at her, blinking slowly, and let out another cry, a threadbare sound that barely stirred the mist. Ellie knelt a few feet away, careful not to crowd it. Her training told her to wait. A bobcat mother might leave her kitten temporarily while she hunts, often watching from a distance. But something about this scene didn't feel right. There were no signs of a nearby den, no prints but the kitten's own, no fresh scat, no broken foliage that would suggest the frantic pacing of a worried mother. No blood, but no comfort either. Just absence. And time. Ellie took out her phone and began recording short clips for the station. Document everything, she reminded herself. These decisions always came under scrutiny later. She stayed for hours, returning to the cabin only briefly to switch out her battery pack and grab a protein bar. All the while, she watched, waited. But the mother never came. The kitten, growing weaker, made fewer sounds as the sun climbed and the day grew warmer. It huddled into the roots of the oak, trying to disappear into itself, the way wild things do when the odds turn against them. Ellie's chest tightened. She'd seen orphaned kits before, but never one this small, this vulnerable. Nature wasn't cruel, she reminded herself. It was just indifferent. Survival wasn't about fairness. It was about strength, timing, luck. She was about to radio in for permission to intervene when a rustling sound behind her stopped her cold. It was deliberate, light but confident. Not the hesitant shuffle of a raccoon or the erratic dash of a squirrel. Ellie turned slowly, brushing her hand near the tranquilizer loop on her belt. Not out of fear, but preparedness. And there, just beyond the thicket, stood a red fox. His coat gleamed even in the dim light, thick and healthy, the kind that spoke of experience in the wild. His eyes were alert but calm, scanning the area before landing on the kitten. Then, briefly, on Ellie. He took a cautious step forward. Everything in Ellie's mind flipped into protocol mode. A fox and a kitten, alone in the forest. This could only end one way. Predator meets prey. But something in the fox's stance stopped her. He wasn't hunting. He didn't crouch, didn't circle. No twitch in his ears, no sharpness in his movements. Instead, he approached the kitten slowly, as if assessing it for something other than food. The kitten stirred, ears flicking. A soft hiss, then a half-hearted swat of its paw. The fox paused, waited. Then, without a sound, he lowered himself to the ground and curled around the kitten. Ellie's mouth went dry. This couldn't be happening. Foxes were opportunists, quick to take advantage of weakness. Yet here he was, shielding it, not attacking. She crouched lower, not daring to interrupt. In a lifetime of field work, Ellie had witnessed many strange things in the wild, but never this, not like this. Something was beginning here, something fragile, unexplained, and deeply, profoundly moving. And it had started with a cry in the fog. The forest held still, as if it too were trying to make sense of what it had just witnessed. Ellie remained motionless behind a patch of mountain laurel, her breath shallow, binoculars trembling slightly in her hands. The fox, this wild, solitary predator, was now lying beside the bobcat kitten like a sentry, tail curled around its tiny body to keep it warm. Micah, as Ellie had started calling the kitten in her head, didn't protest the contact. It was too weak, too exhausted to push back. And the strangest part? The fox, now Cedar in Ellie's whispered commentary, didn't seem to mind. If anything, he looked protective. Ellie stayed for as long as she dared. She didn't want to risk spooking Cedar. The moment was too rare, too delicate to disturb. When the sun had risen a little higher and the morning chill began to fade, Cedar stood, gave the kitten a single glance, and vanished into the woods with the fluid grace of a ghost. The kitten mewed once at his departure, then curled into the leaves, alone again. Ellie radioed into her supervisor at the ranger station. "Rich," she said quietly, still crouching near the oak, "you won't believe what I just saw." "Was it a predation?" he asked. She hesitated. "Number." It was the opposite. That night, Ellie reviewed the footage she'd managed to capture. The resolution wasn't perfect, the light too low, the distance too great, but it was enough to show Cedar curling around the kitten, enough to make her heart race all over again. Theories started forming even before she finished cataloging the scene. Could Cedar have mistaken the kitten for a fox cub? Was he a grieving parent whose own litter hadn't survived the winter? Or was this something different altogether, something less explainable? She returned the next morning, just after sunrise, unsure of what to expect. To her astonishment, Cedar was already there. He had returned. This time, he brought something with him, a small, half-eaten field mouse, gently dropped in front of the kitten. Micah sniffed it, but made no move to eat. Cedar didn't force it. He simply sat nearby, ears swiveling, eyes alert. Ellie remained hidden, careful not to interfere. She captured every minute, Cedar grooming the kitten's fur with delicate licks, using his snout to nudge the mouse closer, shifting his body to block a chilly breeze that had started blowing through the trees. It was parenting behavior, plain and simple, but from the wrong species. By the third visit, Ellie had seen enough to install a few trail cameras around the clearing, discreet, infrared, silent. She didn't want to risk disrupting the fragile relationship forming under that old oak. Back at the station, she showed the footage to Dr. Aaron Patel, a behavioral ecologist who sometimes consulted with the rangers during unusual wildlife events. He watched silently, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When the clip ended, he didn't speak for several seconds. "This isn't opportunism," he finally said. "He's not lingering for a meal. He's caregiving." "But why?" Ellie asked. "They're both predators. They're supposed to be competitors, not companions." Aaron shook his head slowly. "We think we understand wild animals because we draw neat little lines around them. Predator, prey, parent, orphan. But sometimes those lines blur." Cedar returned again that night, and the next. Always at dawn and dusk. Always with quiet purpose. Sometimes with scraps of food, sometimes with nothing at all. Just his presence. Just that strange, steady companionship. And Mika, despite being a bobcat, had started responding in kind. The tiny kitten would toddle out from the hollow to meet him now, tripping over her own oversized paws. She'd nuzzle against his chest, curl beside his belly like she belonged there. Ellie had watched dozens of wildlife rescue cases in her career. She'd helped raise orphaned foxes, released rehabilitated lynxes back into the hills, bandaged birds, buried the ones they couldn't save. But nothing had ever prepared her for this. The laws of nature said this shouldn't happen, but Cedar and Micah weren't listening to those laws. They were writing their own. By the end of the week, the forest clearing had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not for tourists or curious onlookers, Ellie had made sure of that. Only she, and now Dr. Patel, knew exactly where the cameras were hidden, and neither of them had shared the GPS coordinates. This was a sanctuary now, not just for Mika, but for Cedar too. The trail cams captured every tender moment. Like chapters in a story, Nature was telling, one slow page at a time. In one clip, Cedar arrives in the dusky orange glow of evening, a sprig of dry grass trailing from his mouth. Micah peeks out from beneath the roots, stretching her limbs, wobbling unsteadily on her paws. Cedar gently noses her forward, guiding her into the last light of day. She bats at a falling leaf, her tail twitching with cautious curiosity. Cedar watches, tail swishing slowly, the way a parent might watch a child take their first steps. Another clip, early morning. Frost rimmed the ground, and Micah had curled tightly beneath the log. Cedar arrived, circled once, and disappeared, only to return minutes later with a mouthful of moss and dry twigs. He carefully lined the hollow, layering it until it formed a soft cradle. Then he curled up beside her again, his thick tail wrapped around them both like a living blanket. Ellie watched the footage in the ranger station's observation room, her hand pressed over her mouth. She wasn't sure if she was smiling or crying anymore, maybe both. Dr. Patel sat beside her, silent, scribbling notes in a weathered notebook, occasionally shaking his head in quiet disbelief. "This isn't just caregiving," he murmured one evening. "This is nurturing. He's adapting to her needs, adjusting his behavior. Foxes don't build nests like this, not for themselves, not for anyone." Ellie leaned forward, still staring at the monitor. "You think he lost a litter of his own?" "It's possible," Aaron said. "Grief can trigger strange behavior in wild animals. Redirection, surrogate parenting. We've documented cases in captivity, but never like this. Not in the wild, not cross-species." And yet, night after night, Cedar returned. Sometimes, when the cameras caught him arriving, he would stop just short of the hollow and sit very still, ears up, eyes scanning the woods, as if listening, watching, waiting. And it dawned on Ellie that Cedar wasn't just protecting the kitten from the elements. He was watching for threats. Coyotes had passed through the area just days before, their high yips piercing the hills under the moonlight. A hawk had been spotted nesting nearby. There were plenty of reasons a lone bobcat kitten wouldn't survive long out here, but Cedar, against every evolutionary script he'd been born with, had stepped in. As Micah grew stronger, her instincts began to surface. She started exploring a bit more, though never straying far from the oak. She'd pounce clumsily at insects, flatten her ears when startled by sudden noises, and sometimes climb halfway up the trunk, only to tumble down in a confused mess of fur and claws. Through it all, Cedar remained close, watching, guiding. He was patient, always patient, and Ellie, too, found herself changing. She spent less time in her cabin and more time near the clearing, often camping out just far enough to remain unseen. She wrote notes, cataloged behavior, sent clips to a trusted circle of conservationists, but she never shared it publicly. Not yet. "This doesn't belong to science just yet," she told Aaron quietly one evening as they sat beside a small fire. "This is something older, something sacred." Aaron nodded, staring into the flames. "Maybe it's not our job to explain it," he said. "Maybe it's just our job to witness it." And so they watched, the fox and the kitten, two souls that had no reason to meet, no biological script to follow, yet somehow found one another in the silence of the woods. And the forest, always listening, always ancient, seemed to lean in just a little closer, as if it too was waiting to see how this story would end. The forest had settled into its rhythm again. Morning fog gave way to filtered sunlight, and each dusk brought the familiar rustle of paws and brush, Cedar's quiet arrival. For nearly 2 weeks now, this fragile, improbable bond between predator and orphan had held strong. Micah, the kitten once curled up and fading beneath a fallen tree, was growing. Her legs were still awkward, her balance clumsy, but she now ventured further from the nest each day. And Cedar, ever watchful, remained near, her silent guardian. But wild stories rarely unfold without complication. It happened on a Wednesday morning. The cameras picked up the shift before Ellie did. The usual footage, Cedar's early patrol, Micah's sleepy yawn, was interrupted by a new presence, a larger figure, low to the ground, careful but unmistakably feline, a bobcat. Ellie reviewed the footage in stunned silence. The animal emerged from the woods just as the sun began to rise, her coat dusted with dew. She moved with the alert grace only wild-born predators possess, ears flicking, body coiled, muscles fluid beneath her coat. She sniffed near the hollow, paused, then stepped forward, and there it was. A call. Low, soft, more vibration than sound. Micah responded instantly. The kitten had been playing with a twig, batting it between her paws. At the call, she stopped. Her ears perked. Her whole body went still, then began to quiver. She mewed, a short, confused cry, and began to stumble toward the edge of the den. Ellie leaned forward, heart pounding. Could it be? After all this time? Had Micah's mother finally come back? The footage didn't lie. The two bobcats locked eyes. The mother stepped forward, closing the distance with slow, deliberate steps. She lowered her head, touched noses with Micah. Ellie's throat tightened. It was a reunion. Or, at least, it looked like one. But then came the shift. Cedar had been off camera when the mother arrived, but moments later, his familiar shape appeared on the forest edge. His posture was different now, tense, guarded. He held back, his ears slightly flattened, watching the scene unfold. The mother bobcat noticed him too, and her body changed. She turned, her back arched slightly, and released a low, guttural growl. A warning, not to Micah, but to Cedar. Her pupils narrowed, her body stiffened. The message was clear: you don't belong here. Cedar didn't challenge her. He didn't bare his teeth or lunge forward. Instead, he sat down slowly, lowered his tail, and watched. Ellie couldn't breathe. This wasn't the story she expected. It wasn't joyful. It was tense. Micah moved between them, unsure, torn between two figures, one who shared her blood and one who had sheltered her through cold nights and silence. For nearly 30 minutes, the three remained like that. The mother nuzzling Micah, Cedar sitting at a distance. And then, just as suddenly as she had arrived, the mother turned and walked away. She didn't take Micah with her. She simply left. And Micah, after a long pause, turned and toddled back to Cedar. He stood, approached her slowly, and gave her a single lick on the forehead. Then they both disappeared into the trees together. When Ellie showed the footage to Dr. Patel, he shook his head with a look of solemn understanding. That wasn't a reunion, he said quietly. It was a reckoning. She rejected her? Ellie whispered. Not exactly, but she saw another animal had claimed the role she abandoned, and maybe she decided she no longer had a place. Ellie watched the screen again, her chest aching. Nature didn't deal in fairy tales. It dealt in decisions, survival, instinct. The mother had returned, yes, but not to reclaim, not to fight, only to witness what had taken root in her absence. And Micah had made her choice. She had chosen Cedar. The wild was full of rules, unwritten, unwelcome ones. But sometimes love rewrote them, not with words, with actions. And now the forest knew. The fox was no longer a stand-in. He was a father.
The storm rolled in without warning. Ellie had been tracking a different weather system altogether, a mild front expected to pass harmlessly through the edge of the park. But the mountains had a way of birthing their own weather, wild and personal. By nightfall, winds howled down the ravines like ancient ghosts. Branches snapped in sharp, angry bursts. The sky split open with lightning, and the air tasted like copper and fear. Ellie's first thought wasn't for her cabin or her truck or the path back to town. It was for the hollow beneath the oak, for Micah, for Cedar. She grabbed her field jacket, boots still half-laced, and tore out into the storm. It was too dangerous to drive the full trail, so she parked at the last pull-off and sprinted the rest on foot, slipping through wet ferns, ducking under branches made wild by wind. The trail was a blur of rain and mud, her flashlight beam barely piercing the chaos. She arrived at the clearing breathless, soaked to the bone, heart in her throat. The oak was still standing, but the world around it had changed. Debris littered the ground. A nearby sapling had splintered in half, its top half now lodged dangerously close to the hollow's entrance. Ellie dropped to her knees and shone her light inside. Empty, no Cedar, no Micah. She called out, quietly at first, then louder. Nothing. Then she began searching. The forest swallowed light in great gulps. Everything looked unfamiliar, wrong. Each footstep felt like it could crush something vital. She called their names again. Pointless, maybe, but she needed to believe the sound of her voice could anchor them. And then, movement, a rustle beyond the rise. She scrambled up a slick rock, slipping once, knees scraped raw, and aimed her light toward the sound. There. Cedar. He was limping. His coat was drenched, one leg dragging awkwardly behind him. He was standing over something small, curled, motionless, barely visible under a tangle of storm-tossed branches. Micah. Ellie didn't think. She ran. Cedar growled, low and uncertain, but didn't flee. He stood his ground, even as she approached. His eyes met hers through the rain. It was trust, not full, not complete, but enough. She knelt beside Mika and cleared the branches gently. The kitten was breathing, shallow, ragged, but breathing. One paw was twisted unnaturally, and her belly rose and fell with strained rhythm. Ellie pulled off her jacket, cradled Mika inside it, and glanced up at Cedar. "You saved her," she whispered. Cedar blinked slowly, then sat down beside them, chest heaving from exhaustion. He didn't run. He didn't vanish. He just stayed, mud-slicked and silent, while Ellie called it in. An emergency vet crew from the sanctuary arrived an hour later, headlights cutting through the trees like spears of hope. They worked fast, gentle hands assessing injuries, lifting Mika onto a makeshift stretcher. Cedar didn't interfere. But when they started to leave, when the men turned with Mika bundled and secured, he took a step forward. Not to attack, not to resist, just to follow. Ellie placed a hand on his chest, the first time she'd dared touch him. His fur was thick, matted with rain, trembling. "She's going to be okay," she whispered. "You did more than anyone could have asked. Let us take it from here." Cedar didn't move for a long time. Then, finally, he stepped back and vanished into the forest once more. That night, Ellie didn't sleep. Neither did anyone at the rescue center. Mika had a broken paw, early-stage hypothermia, and several bruised ribs. But she would survive. The vet, a soft-spoken woman named Marisol, looked up after examining her and said, "If that fox hadn't kept her warm, hadn't shielded her, she wouldn't have made it through the night." Back in the woods, Cedar's den remained empty for days. Ellie returned several times, searching, scanning. No tracks, no sign, only silence. Some believe that wild animals vanish when their purpose is fulfilled. But Ellie held on to something else. That sometimes, when you give everything you have for someone who isn't even your own, the forest grants you peace. Weeks passed. Micah healed slowly under the watchful care of Ellie and the staff at the wildlife sanctuary. Her paw was splinted, her ribs wrapped gently beneath her tawny fur. Though she bristled at the human hands that fed and treated her, she never hissed, never lashed out. There was a calmness in her eyes, an alert intelligence that, more than once, made Ellie pause and say quietly, "You learned that from him, didn't you?" And she had. Micah wasn't just recovering, she was evolving. Her instincts sharpened with each passing day. She stalked the corners of her enclosure with quiet confidence. She tested heights, climbed with increasing grace. Her appetite returned with a vengeance, and she let no meal go unfinished. But something was missing. It wasn't until her rehabilitation was nearly complete that Ellie allowed herself to admit what they all saw. Micah had grown strong enough to return to the wild. Ellie stood alone near the edge of the release site, the woods at her back, the crate beside her. The trees swayed gently in the late summer wind. Somewhere, far beyond the ridge, a fox might be watching, or might not be. Ellie didn't know if Cedar was still out there. He had not returned, not even once, but she could feel him, somehow, like a memory the land itself hadn't forgotten. The door to the crate opened with a soft click. Mika stepped out slowly, blinking against the sunlight. She sniffed the breeze, ears twitching, body low to the ground. Then, without looking back, she moved, graceful now, fluid, purposeful, into the underbrush. Ellie stayed long after the bobcat disappeared from view, long enough for the shadows to stretch across the forest floor, long enough to feel the quiet settle in again. And then, a flicker. A fox, red as fire, standing at the far edge of the clearing. It wasn't Cedar. She knew that instantly. This one was younger, leaner. But it paused in exactly the same way, just long enough to meet her eyes. Then it vanished. Ellie smiled slowly, hand resting on the worn notebook in her pack. Weeks later, the story of Mika and Cedar would ripple out beyond the sanctuary, carefully told, lovingly documented. It became a case study in behavior no textbook could explain. Wildlife experts spoke of cross-species nurturing, of trauma-bonded instincts, of environmental anomaly. But Ellie never used those words. To her, it had been something much simpler, and far more extraordinary. It was love, not the kind humans like to label, not neat or symmetrical or ode, but the kind that emerges in the silence between survival and sacrifice. When one life reaches out, without reason, without promise, and shields another. Micah would go on to live a full life in the forest. She would be seen now and then on trail cams, her stride confident, her coat thick and gleaming. Never with other bobcats. Always alone, but always near the edge of fox territory, as if she still remembered, as if she was still watched over. And maybe she was. Maybe in that great ancient network of trees and roots and wild memories, Cedar's presence lingered. Not as myth, but as legacy. A quiet, crimson shadow beneath the branches. A heart that once chose love over instinct. And a story that would be told softly, reverently for generations to come.